of those points. With that, I would like to hand over to Ambassador Taye Selassie Amde from Ethiopia to give his welcoming remarks. Atu Taye.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. And at the outset, I would like to thank Pathfinders for the initiative and express my appreciation to all the co-sponsors for organizing this important and timely side event, as we all, as Sarah mentioned, grapple to overcome the human and economic and social toll of the COVID-19 pandemic. Let me also convey the greetings and apologies of my Minister of Labor and Social Affairs of Ethiopia, Dr. Irgogo Tesfaye, who was not able to join today's meeting due to some technical difficulties. However, I want to note that Ethiopia is happy to sponsor today's event, since the issue of social protection is an integral part of our 10-year national development plan. We believe that we have lessons to share from our experience with particularly with the productive safety net program, and but especially within the context of the COVID-19. We are interested to learn from the experience of other developing countries. Ethiopia also has imperative lessons, including those drawn from working with partners, and the role of also resilient logistic capabilities on the continent, which we did, of course, tried our level best to distribute essential PPEs for closely to 40 African countries in collaboration with multilateral agencies, and as well as a number of countries. Let me also, in the broadest sense, welcome the support of the Pathfinder initiative and other partners for Ethiopia's reform efforts, especially in the context of aligning the Sustainable Development Goals with our National Development Plan and incorporating SDG 16+ into the work streams of different line ministries that are putting efforts to tackle inequalities and exclusion. In this regard, I would like to reiterate my country's commitment to equality and inclusion, and emphasize the critical importance of multi-track reform spearheaded by my Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. It is necessary to note that the reforms currently underway in Ethiopia are in response basically to calls for greater representation and inclusion by a large segment of our society. Before I conclude, I want to underscore the high-level political forum on sustainable development is an important opportunity to share lessons and learn from each other experience. In this regard, identifying implementation gaps, accelerating actions to rebuild efforts on the mobilization of support for developing countries remains indeed critical. As always, Ethiopia is fully committed and supports realization of the SDG 16+ agenda, as the outlined objectives align with our national aspiration of building a peaceful and inclusive society, including the need to ensuring access to justice for all. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Atu Taye, for those remarks, and indeed for the contribution that Ethiopia has made in the region to helping to overcome logistical difficulties in the distribution of PPE and other material to combat COVID-19. Ambassador, you drew some attention to the direction that has been followed in Ethiopia of looking at a multi-track reform that goes across sectors. And I know that our next speaker also will relate to that. So I'm delighted to introduce Ibu Diani Sadiawati from the Ministry of Planning, Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Planning in Indonesia. Indonesia has a deep experience in the last 30 years, in fact, of strengthening and developing social protection programs. But I know, Ibu Diani, that these have now been under a new strain in the face of COVID-19. So it would be very interesting to hear a little more about what the government has done in response. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ibu Sarah. So a very good morning for all of us. And first and foremost, that on behalf of our minister, I would like to express my sincere apologies that for his absence on this forum, because our minister, I think also many countries has a very hectic schedule in terms of to accelerating the COVID-19 policy. So he sends the warmest regards for every participants, and he believes that this forum will be a stepping stone to improve policy making decision and effective solutions to strengthen public welfare, of course. And secondly, I would like to extend my heartfelt appreciation to NYU CIC, to Ibu Sarah, who has been facilitating the event, as I'm delighted to partake in this side event session. So the theme for our current discussion resonates that within Indonesia's long-term vision on the state welfare, social protection, and is also part of the core of the Sustainable Development Agenda. So the unexpected pandemic that has affected each of every one of us is something that cannot be taken for granted, particularly on economic and health sector. So the pandemic become a catalyst for restructuring the betterment of our society. So it is also a silver lining for each state's development progress to protect the people, of course, but also another aspect to strengthen the economic growth. I think every country now face of the situation. So we are fully aware that the unprecedented outbreak of COVID-19 will consequently give burden to various sectors. I think Ibu Sarah already mentioned, and we believe also that not a single country has yet mastered in solving this the crisis. So Indonesia government took quick actions in formalizing quick response policy to minimize the downfall of economic growth and also to lessen social problems and also speed up social protection policies and practices. And also we understand that the importance of saving human life as the top priority, but at the same time, health crisis and virus outbreak have to be addressed quickly and accurately, so that economy will gradually back into its stage after the virus can be contained, hopefully. So our quick response policy focuses on three policies. First, about the social protection. Second, about the healthcare, and then the economic itself. And the first one, we put social protection as our priority with the biggest budget allocation. I think it is very important as well, that in total, the government allocates 16.4 billion US dollar to uplift the social safety net. So this includes financial support via unconditional cash transfer, electrical subsidy, meal coupon card, and incentive for those affected by involuntary unemployment. Secondly, in this time of health crisis, economic sector might decline to its lowest point. I think everybody also experienced with that. And in terms of Indonesia experience, the stimulus from the government that is delivered varies from subsidy for micro, small, and medium enterprises, and also tax remittance for industrial sector estimated to be around 11.04 billion US dollar, to strengthen the market. And certainly, we learn from these new and harmful non-disasters that it cannot be addressed with one-size-fits-all policy. So meaning that any treatment for each region has to be based on accurate and reliable data. So the government in this case allocate 5.3 billion US dollar to strengthen the health sector to minimize the pandemic impact. These include hospital bill payment, allowance for paramedics, and subsidy for national health care system. So this time is also our moment of reflection to enhance our healthcare system, especially for those bottom 40% of the population. So for Indonesia, social protection is like a home foundation that needs to be supported by health, economic, law, and governance pillars so that the outcome will target people in need. That is what we have been doing to minimize the impact of COVID-19 by integrating the 3 quick response policies. I think this is very important for us. And it is also a reminder that justice is not always formally seen in the court, but to ease the burden of people and maintain equal treatment during these hard times. So in the context of COVID-19, we are currently readjusting the current and upcoming policy. So this might be also the step other countries do. Our policy specifically target social protection issue. As for this year, Indonesia prepares reform on social protection system. And for the following year, the reform will focus on the early recovery. Hopefully, we hope that the COVID can be settled this year. So next year, we are going to how that to make a recovery from this COVID-19. And also, it includes the economic stimulus, but accompanied by a strict health protocol. I think it's very important, and hopefully that this policy will benefit for the people that are vulnerable. So for the next year, we have specific policy, 3 specific policies like recovery of industry, tourism and investment. The second one, national health system reform. And the third one, disaster resilient system reform, because right now we only focus on the disaster nature, but non-nature disaster, we still try to also to formulate in terms of our law. So in conclusion, I would like to emphasize that our step will be more anticipated and accommodated public needs. I think what Ibu Sarah already mentioned about the trust between the state and citizen. I think we in Indonesia still face such kind of challenges, how to build a trust between state and citizen in terms of the how to conduct a transparent and also accountability of the distribution of the cash transfer, and also involve that how to make a transition to the new normal. So the strategy applies not only to encounter the unexpected second wave of pandemic, but also to build back better. So this also includes raising public awareness for disciplined action. I think Indonesia is we have a very big problem in terms of discipline, but Indonesia also commit to maintain a just and equal opportunity, as well as an inclusive society by applying good governance and transparency of data and information to prevent any moral hazard of social protection program implementation. So we believe that the role of SDGs 16 plus as the enabler of other goals in the SDGs implementation is crucial. So lastly, Indonesia sends our highest support for every country that has been through hard times during COVID-19 pandemic. And I think it is time for us to strengthen our global collaboration and initiative, even though I know that it's very also very quite difficult and challenges. And also for us, that is also a wake-up call for every country to further reshaping a sustainable future development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diani. And I think you underlined a couple of points that are very important for our discussion. One is that this crisis presents both a need and an opportunity to look at reforming some of the underlying systems. And what you said about looking at reforms to the health system and to social protection systems going forward from this year onwards, I think is very important. The exchange on the lessons of how to do that is going to be very important as we proceed. The other thing that you said that I think is extremely important is the link between ensuring equal treatment for all in the face of this pandemic and the issue of trust. Because we know if we look at the most recent large global crisis, while it didn't reach the level of COVID-19 in its impact, but after the financial crisis, some of the stimulus programs that were issued really didn't operate to increase trust. They actually operated in some countries to make people feel that some benefited and not others. So I think that point is very well taken. Luis, Ambassador Bermudez of Uruguay, it's a great pleasure to welcome you. Over to you.
Likewise, Sarah, thank you very much to you and Pathfinders for virtually hosting us today. I'm very honored to be part of this panel. It is important to emphasize that being deeply rooted in our societies and requiring long-term cultural change to address them effectively, inequalities are one of the greatest challenges facing the world. The increase in social gaps ends up fracturing and dividing a society, generating detrimental effects on environmental, social, and economic sustainability, increasing poverty, insecurity, delinquency, hate speech, etc. In Uruguay, taking into account the policies that were already being developed, a large part of the responses to the pandemic arise from the implementation of novel fiscal policies. And in this regard, a large part of the fiscal expenditure is destined to the implementation of social policies tending to the reduction of inequalities. So for the time restraint, I will just share with you the headlines and the main features of the programs that are in force now. The newest I will mention as Social Protection 1. On April 2nd, Parliament approved a bill proposed by the executive power to create a COVID-19 Solidarity Fund. This fund is financed, among other items, by the collection of the emergency or COVID-19 emergency health tax on those who receive income from the public sector, including non-state public persons and private law companies whose majority shareholder is the state, as well as an additional to the Social Security Assistance tax that will be levied on retirement benefits exceeding a nominal amount of $3,000, what in Uruguay is 120,000 Uruguayan pesos monthly. COVID-19 Solidarity Fund will be destined to attend to all state activity aimed at protecting the population against the national health emergency and the expenditures that the Ministry of Public Health and other public health providers must attend to directly or through aid and transfers to private providers. But most important, the fund ensures the payment of the benefits of health insurance and unemployment insurance provided by the National Social Security Institution. Due to the health emergency caused by the coronavirus since March 13, where Uruguay adopted the first measures, and the reduction of economic activity, the collection of the Social Security Institution has fallen dramatically. In this context, the government understood from the beginning the importance of maintaining social policies, such as maintain universal access to a high quality care, the national care system, ensure minimum wage, and the basic income family basket, to meet the needs of the most vulnerable, and to that end, maintaining a strong social security system was the essential tool to avoid setbacks and continue building to achieve sustainable development for all. This is the main feature of this new COVID-19 fund. Now I will very briefly share with you what other programs already enforced before COVID-19. This is Social Protection 2. This is, for instance, the National Care System, a system designed so that all girls, boys, persons with disabilities, and elderly people with dependency enjoy the right to be cared for, recognizing the social value of the people who perform the care. It is a model of co-responsibility between the state, the community, families, and the market, as well as the shared responsibility between men and women in the face of a clear inequality in the gender division of care work. The system consists of the creation of a fund by which the state assumes the cost of care, mobilizing the economy, ensuring the right to be cared for by the most vulnerable groups, recognizing unpaid work that has historically been neglected, and facilitating thus the entry into the labor market of a very large sector of the population. Now we move to Social Protection 3. Uruguay has started since 2006 as information system to reduce poverty and vulnerability. The system addresses challenges faced by many governments in targeting and coordinating social assistance, and with reduced cost from license-free software, it could soon be replicated or might be replicated in other countries. It consists on to address these challenges of dispersion of the information, and in association with the World Bank in 2006, Uruguay Ministry of Social Development decided to explore and designing an integrated information systems to link relevant institutions, complete with indicators for development, tracking, and extending social programs to those who most need them. The result was the proposed integrated information system for the social area that is still in force. Social Protection 4. Building a culture of social protection. In 2007, Uruguay launched an education initiative on social security, which aims to inform the population on their rights and obligations, promote active participation in the improvement of the social security system, and extend its coverage. The program is part of a comprehensive approach to build a fairer society and ensure decent lives for all. Through a joint effort between the Social Security Institution, BPS in Uruguay, and the institutions responsible for education and culture, the government of Uruguay introduced content on social security to the curricula used in all schools and professional training institutions at all levels. To date, a program called Know Your Rights and Obligations to Social Security reaches 100% of students, including children from 5 years of age, adolescents attending high school, and adults attending vocational training institution or finalizing formal studies. And finally, allow me to share with you Social Protection number 5. Social Protection number 5 consists on or gathers long-standing tradition in Uruguay of the work of cooperatives, which have been in existence for over a century, with about 1 million affiliated members in 2018. The Uruguayan Federation of Mutual Aid Housing Cooperatives, a movement known as FUCBAN, is the largest and oldest federation of housing cooperatives in Latin America. The Uruguayan housing cooperative model, in which citizens mobilize resources to purchase land, build housing, and manage the units collectively. Is characterized by the concept of sweat equity, relying in the joint physical labor of its members to build the housing and thus reducing the borrowed capital required to purchase and develop the land. I'm rather leave it here, then we may increase something of these concepts or idea during the Q&A segment. So more or less this is a headlines and a small development of what are the programs in force nowadays. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and I hope we'll be able to come back to you and Diani in questions. That was fascinating on the emergency fund, the national care system, and the way you've adapted the existing programs. It provides an excellent segue for me to turn to Undersecretary General Alicia Barcena on behalf of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. So Alicia, of course, the region has been very hard hit in the last period. But I know the region is also really a hub for innovation and for different ways of reaching citizens. And part of the experience we just heard from Uruguay illustrates that. It would be good to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. I thank the government of Ethiopia and Uruguay and Indonesia. I really want to congratulate Uruguay. It's one of the countries that has handled the crisis better than any other in South America, together with Costa Rica. So I think it's really something that we need to recognize. And it's also because they had a system before in place. I mean, the social security, the health, and they are now complementing it, as we just heard. Building back better in Latin America and the Caribbean means building back with equality, because the cost of inequality has become untenable. And pandemics has exposed structural gaps in social protection and health systems. And we know that our governments, unfortunately, are facing state capacity that is weak. And also investing has not been there. Privatization, outsourcing has been the name of the game. And that really requires a different response. The response also requires a new social compact that rebalances the role of states, markets, and civil society with emphasis on transparency, accountability, and support on democracy, strengthening the rule of law, and of course, fighting against corruption, which has been something that we need to build in. The culture of privilege, we have spoken about this before, and we feel that the culture of privilege has to be definitely taken out of this region and of the world, hopefully, because the culture of privilege is taking us, for example, to tax avoidance, which is a very good example of the culture of privilege. So we believe also that we need a renewed industrial policies to transform the productive structure into big environmental push. And let me tell you that this is going to be the worst recession in the century, 9.1% contraction, with unemployment is going to reach almost 44 million people, and high rates of informality. 54% of our region, of the population that works, is informal, and with very low access to contributory system. 58% are not affiliated to a pension system. And the poverty is going to increase. We're going to have 230 million people poorer. In our region, 37% of the population, and the extreme poor is going to reach 15%, 28 million more. 96 million are going to be in extreme poverty, and this means that these people do not have access to the basics on nutrition. So, and you were talking about the population highly hit. Women, indeed, in our region are highly hit. For 100 men poor, we have 113 women poor. So poverty has a women's face. And also women are participating, for example, 77% of women are employed in the health sector with 25 less lower incomes. That's totally unfair. So, and elders are also very highly hit. As you know, 85 million people in our region are elders. Indigenous peoples, 63 million, and Afro-descendants are 130 million, are very highly hit. But let me tell you that we have to address the digital gap. That for us is extremely important. Of 170 million students, only 20% have full access to internet, to quality internet. That's tremendous. And only 26% of the formal workers can do teleworking. So indeed, I think digital is really a very important aspect. So let me quickly tell you that in the region, we have created a COVID observatory in which we have accounted for all the measures that governments are taking. We have already accounted for 194 protection measures of $69 billion, 1.4% of GDP, which means that they have improved cash transfers, they have improved the extension, the disbursements, the expansion, and this is very important. But we are facing two main obstacles. One is the lack of financial inclusion and the digital gap. And the food transfers have increased because of the hunger risk that is happening in our region. We are proposing in ECLAC, and we are happy to say that some governments are taking this over very well, a basic emergency income for 6 months, which is equal to one line of poverty, $140 per month for 6 months. And this will require an additional expenditure of 1.9% of GDP. We have also suggested an anti-hunger grant or bonus that represents 70% of the extreme line of poverty line, which is $50 per month. It's not that much. And the other two measures that we are suggesting is because 2.7 million formal companies are going to close, and 2.6 million of those are micro enterprises, and we are going to lose approximately 9 million jobs. So we are proposing the extension of how to bring liquidity to these companies. So we are suggesting subsidies to the micro enterprises, concrete subsidies, to co-finance the company payrolls for 6 months, at least for these micro and medium-sized companies, and also to make direct cash transfers to independent workers. That is very important because they are formal, but they are losing their companies. And for a longer-term perspective, and this I'm closing, we have the following suggestions. Number one, as I said, a social compact, change the conversation between the state, the private, and the society, move towards a universal basic income. I think this is essential because after the pandemics, we're going to be poor, we're going to be unequal, we're going to be hungry, and we're going to be angry. So we better do something right now. So implement the universal, and I would say policy basis, and we have to understand that we are confusing value with costs. And what are we valuing? Are we valuing the infrastructure of health? That means social protections and health. Let's not confuse value with cost. And finally, I would say this progressive structural change with a big environmental push. And the last thing is these instruments, financial. I would say that this region has to come together with financial proposals. For example, a debt sustainability, a standstill in debt services, the special drawing rights. We need an issuance of at least $500 billion. Hurricane bonds, we are exploring the hurricane bonds and the social bonds and the green bonds, but they have to be a norm for the IMF and for the World Bank. It cannot be applied only on a case-by-case basis. It has to be general. And all these, Sarah, comes together and has to be taken on board because this region, the pandemics hit the region when the confidence in public institutions was very, very low. And we are really facing, I would say, a problem in which civil society, social unrest could come back. And we have to really confront democracy can be aggravated. And if we don't confront carefully these dilemmas, false dilemmas, by the way, between health, economy, and democracy. Over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And I see very vociferous nodding across the panel, certainly as you were speaking. So I think many of those points were very, very well taken. As you underlined, this is a crisis which exposes some issues that are deep inside society's culture. So building back better, I think we have to assume is not just, as we would say after a natural disaster, a kind of infrastructure or superficial task. This means really looking at the culture of democracies. As Diani also said, the relationship between citizens and the state in how we do things. It's my pleasure to turn over to Under Secretary General Rola Dashti from the Economic and Social Commission of West Asia. Rola, I know you're connecting from Beirut and the connection is sometimes a little unstable, but we welcome you and please look forward to your thoughts on the region.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. And my thanks also for the government of Ethiopia, Indonesia, and Uruguay, and others for sponsoring this event. And Let me follow up to what Alicia's remark and our previous colleagues, what they have said so far. I believe we urgently need a revolution in our thinking and approach regarding inequalities, inclusion, and support to vulnerable groups. A structural transformative approach built on societal solidarity and shared responsibility, I think it's the starting point. Recovering forward better and fast from COVID is a shared responsibility of all stakeholders and not the governments alone. It requires a culture of societal solidarity to invest in survival of people and their livelihoods, and investment in survival of businesses, especially the medium, small, and medium enterprise, micro and small, medium enterprises. At the national level, we believe that shared economic benefits, inequality reduction, and inclusive development require shared responsibility and societal solidarity among relevant stakeholders. What do I mean? Governments, usually with limited financing means, resort usually to private sector in a private-public partnership cooperative arrangement to help in development of infrastructure project. Then why not have government reach out to the top wealthiest citizens in society to support in uplifting the poor and create opportunities to them as part of the wealthiest group, shared responsibility and societal solidarity. In our region, we found that less than 2% contribution of the top 10 percentile of the wealthiest individuals in each of the middle income countries to a solidarity fund can uplift the poor in these countries and support in addressing COVID impact. However, this is not the case for LDCs, which will need regional and international solidarity support. What I'm advocating here is the creation of a social solidarity fund at the national level, managed by the top wealthiest citizens with government support and coordination. The fund purpose is to target the poor, to uplift them from poverty and create opportunities for them. I'm not talking about taxing the wealthy and fund money goes to government budget. I'm not talking about making the poor rich and the rich poor. I'm talking about shared responsibility between the government and the top wealthiest group through solidarity and societal partnership to support the poor outside the government budgets and mechanisms. In the similar spirit of shared responsibility and societal solidarity, we are also advocating that the chambers of commerce in the region champion revisiting the role of private sector during times of crisis, from profit maximization and protecting shareholder interest to business solidarity maximization and advancing societal responsibility and sustainability. Large businesses and corporations in our region, we are pushing them, should strengthen their society solidarity to support the survival of the most vulnerable small, medium enterprises by integrating them in the supply chain, favoring them in procurement and subcontracting, and providing them with rental relief and debt suspensions. We heard a couple of governments on the social protection policies that they have been adopting. And we found out through our COVID tracker, global COVID tracking, public policies and stimulus packages, we found out that cash transfers and other income support measures top the list of policy actions announced in the Arab region and globally. And our previous colleagues have elaborated on the different mechanisms that they have used. But to us, as it stands today, cash transfers are mostly directed towards consumption purposes, helping the extreme poor, but not uplifting their mobility upwards. Also, cash transfers are unsustainable and vulnerable to fiscal shocks. Hence, we need a structural transformative approach to cash transfers to ensure sustainability, enhance social upward mobility, and build productive human capacity. And a good starting point would be to adopt values of shared responsibility, embrace principles of societal solidarity, and implement an innovative smart spending approach to this issue. At the global level, we found out that the fiscal stimulus packages announced by the developing countries and LDCs is significantly lower than that announced by the developed countries. This, as we are seeing, will lead to widening inequalities in building back better among countries and will jeopardize the swift recovery of developing countries and LDCs from the pandemic. 75% of the global $9.6 trillion fiscal stimulus packages to build back better from the adverse impact of COVID-19 come from G7 countries alone. The Arab regions need at least an additional $50 billion to the $100 billion already announced to recover. Therefore, in the spirit of shared responsibility for achieving global recovery, and in addition to what Alicia has highlighted, we call upon the creation of a social solidarity fund supported by the wealthiest country to assist the vulnerable and poor countries in addressing COVID-19 impact, provided that such a fund does not add to the country's existing fiscal stress. And then I conclude, this is an unprecedented threat, calls for unprecedented solidarity and shared responsibility with Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals as our pathway. Thank you.
Thank you, Rola. And you've built on what other speakers said, I think very usefully, to look at issues of the financing of the massive investment in social protection that is now needed, because in effect, we can't adopt approaches that reach those that need to be reached without thinking about the financing. What you said about solidarity contributions and thinking of these as being an investment of everyone in society, including the wealthiest, in systems that are resilient, I think is an important part of future directions. And it relates also to what other speakers such as Ambassador Bermudez for Uruguay have said. It's my pleasure now to turn over to Romina Guarini. Romina, I know that you have a new title now. I think you're acting director now for the OECD Center on Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunity. So that has in those phrases all of the issues I think that we're looking at here. Look forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you're going to see it. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you to Pathfinders and to the New York University Center on International Cooperation for bringing us together. And I'd like to start indeed by referring to some of the fundamental underpinnings that the OECD has highlighted in terms of what needs to be sort of to change as we go forward. And so I'd like to very, very quickly recall the Inclusive Growth Framework, which the organization has developed over the last few years. The basic objective of that framework is really putting people at the center. And again, this is an agenda that started well before the pandemic, of course, but this is an agenda that is very much needed today because, as many speakers just recalled, the pandemic is highlighting all the great inequalities in all countries of the world, in particular in OECD, and all the other type of vulnerabilities that many people and many households are facing. And then I'd like to talk about a tool that the OECD is using to collect data that looks at people's demands and preferences to build public support for inclusive policies. And this is a very important tool because it really is a very concrete, tangible application of giving people a voice to actually, take part in this debate and tell what is that they consider to be inclusive policies. Therefore, this tool is going to, in fact, provide new insights for building back better. And finally, I'd like to say a few words about the type of work that the OECD has just done on social protection. Today, we in fact released our Employment Outlook, which is one of our flagship publications, showing how dramatic are the economic and jobs and social inputs of the pandemic, and also highlighting what is the type of response that is needed in terms of social protection. So going quickly to the sort of the basic concept here, so the basic question is really how do we make sure that growth is coming from reducing inequalities and making sure that is there to support prosperity for all. And the type of sort of mechanisms that the OECD has highlighted in that respect relate to the importance of making sure that markets are working fairly and in an inclusive manner. But at the same time, of course, there are some important investments that need to be sustained over time to make sure that we are building, in fact, the foundations of future prosperity. So this is all the action that is related to the idea that we need to pre-distribute opportunities. And finally, the dimensions of governance, which is in fact the one that connects the best with the program of Pathfinders, which looks at the issue of how to make sure that the institutional frameworks and the institutions in fact can be designed and can be delivered on the IG's agendas and SDGs. So the three sort of basic dynamics that the OECD as when it comes to inclusive growth are, first of all, the idea of investing in people and places left behind. And so this is very, very, simply means that it is important to make sure that all individuals, and particularly those that are being left behind or live in places left behind, can get access to basic goods, but also to health, good quality health and good quality education from the very early years of life. And this is also about making sure that the territorial gaps can be in fact completely bridged. So it does require quite a lot of investments in terms of housing and infrastructures. Again, these are really all issues that come very prominently in many OECD economies today. The second type of big dynamics that policies are there to catalyze to ensure that growth is really inclusive is making sure that there is enough business dynamisms. Many of you, in fact, have already talked about the importance of weathering the storm and really protecting, during the pandemic, the small and medium enterprises, because of course these are the ones that are going to be, already have been hit and are going to be hit the most by the crisis. And so it is really crucial when it comes to ensuring that the sources of growth are sort of broadly based and well distributed. It is really important to think about actions that protect small and medium enterprises and young startups. And at the same time, it's all about making sure that labor markets are inclusive. That means a number of, in fact, actions from the issues, of course, from the issue that relates to sort of gender inclusivity, but also everything that connects with inclusion for ethnic minorities. And so it relates to issues such as, for instance, ensuring that there is no wage discrimination, and but also making sure that all the low-educated and low-income workers are provided with skills and opportunity to reskill and upskill. And of course, again, this was already the case. I mean, that need was already there very much before the pandemic, and it's now clearly reinforced. So the third and final type of dynamics that we are highlighting in our framework is this idea that it's important to build efficient and responsive governments. And let me say that this is very much related to the point you made, Sarah, at the very outset of this conversation on trust. And so what we know is that, in fact, what is underpinning trust is not just the fact that governments are efficient and responsive. Of course, this is very important, that they act, in a way that is clearly using, let's say, available resources in the best possible manner, that are able to respond, to shocks such as the pandemic. But it's also about, again, making sure that the government response and the policies that are put in place are actually inclusive. So that actually connects to the next point I wanted to make, which is about how do we make sure that those institutions and the policies are actually designed in a very, very way that, again, gives a prominent role to people's voice. So how do we make sure that perceptions that people have around inequalities, around vulnerabilities, around well-being outcomes, and how those are distributed, how can we make sure that those perceptions and the demands for social protections, the demands for public interventions, how we can make sure that this is all embedded in the policy's response. So as I said, this is a framework that the OECD, in fact, designed 2 years ago, that was endorsed by the OECD ministers 2 years ago. And again, this is a framework that is becoming extremely timely and extremely handy at the time as we speak, because we all know how dramatic again is the crisis that we are living, and OECD countries are not so spared by that. So as I said at the very beginning, the OECD released today its employment outlook. And in that outlook, we documented the really unprecedented jobs impact that the pandemic is having on OECD economies. At the end of May, of the month of May, there were about 54.5 million of unemployed. We are estimating that by the end of 2020, the unemployment rate in OECD countries is going to double. So this is actually, the type of shock is 10 times bigger than that of the global financial crisis that occurred at the end of 2000. And of course, as many of you already have said, the problem is that those inputs are not, evenly distributed. Those inputs are massively concentrated towards the ones that are already the most vulnerable. So in fact, we know that the larger employment declines are actually for the low-paid workers. We know that youth are also the ones that are really hit the hardest. And again, this is OECD economists. So let me now go to the tool I'd like to talk to you about today, because it's something that was actually developed by the OECD in 2015, but we are now revamping it with the view of collecting new information about what are the people's preferences for redistribution. So the importance of this
is a fascinating tool, Romina. I'm just aware because of time that we'll have to
let me
move
go very quickly
through the presentation. So, this is fascinating.
Yes, thank you so much. So why this is important, because as I mentioned, what really matters at the end of the day is people perceptions about what they think is a fair distribution of opportunities and outcomes in the societies. And the usual type of, I would say policy advice that OECD and other organizations sort of base themselves on is just looking at the objective outcomes. And so they just look at things such, or they just build on the analysis of objective distribution, income distribution. And so this tool is actually asking people how they perceive the income distribution. And we know that demand for a distribution is actually very much related and dependent on those perceptions, much more in fact, so it depends much more on the perception than on the actual distribution outcomes. So this is a web tool. You can test it. It's really user-friendly. It exists for OECD countries, but we're now planning, in fact, to build it for non-OECD, and we have a special interest, in fact, in introducing the tool for LAC as well. We had a number of requests from those countries that are partnering with us, because of course those issues of political economy really are very important in those countries as well. So very, very quickly, what is that this tool shows us? And so the tool does two things. First of all, it really asks about what type of perceptions of inequality are there. So people, some tools that describe the distribution of income in their economies, and they have to say, to what extent they have to give a sort of prediction of where their economy and society stands with respect, to four possible type of distributions. These are the diagrams that you can see. So the one that you have on the on your left-hand side relate to or describe, let's say, very high unequal societies, and the other ones are showing the distribution of income and low or in countries that are more egalitarian. And so what we see, and you can actually have a snapshot of that result in the first diagram on your right-hand side, is that in fact, if you live in a very unequal society, so for instance, you live in Mexico, then you actually have a quite good understanding of where you are, so you actually will tend to say that your country is it's very unequal. And by contrast, if you live in a more egalitarian country, so for instance, you come from Norway, you will tend to say that the distribution of income is actually more even. But very interestingly, and that I would say this is really the highlight that comes from the study and from this data, is that when you ask people about where's that they would like to live, and so what is the desired income distribution, this is actually the same in all countries. And so again, regardless of the actual perception of income inequality, people respond to this question to say that they would like to live in a more egalitarian society. Very quickly, the new model that we just introduced, indeed to look at to what extent the pandemic is having a big impact on the support for the distribution. Very preliminary results, I must say, because this was in fact put on the web just a few weeks ago, so of course needs to be sort of interpreted with care. But interestingly, what we observe is that over 60% of the users would like governments to take further action to reduce inequalities. Only 1 in 4 are happy with governments are doing at the moment, to reduce inequalities, and only 10% would like governments to take a step back. We also ask you questions about what type of social policy areas should be prioritized, and the top priorities are education, health, poverty reduction, and housing. There's also a question around fairness of taxes and to what extent the system is progressive enough. And what we find out is that the average users would like to see a progressive tax system. So just to conclude, what is the type of advice we are giving now to countries, to OECD countries, when it comes to reinforcing their social protection system in the wake of the crisis, but also, as a way to foster the recovery? A very important aspect is the type of schemes that OECD countries have introduced to retain jobs. And those, in fact, have been very effective at limiting unemployment in the first stages of the pandemic. In fact, even more effective than, let's say, the standard type of unemployment insurance schemes that are present in OECD economies. So now, as countries move the recovery stage, and in fact, they will have to do the job of actually continuing to use those measures, but target those really to the ones that need it the most. And they also have to combine those with active labor market policies to ensure that some of the people that have been, and so the ones that have been obviously hit the hardest, can find new jobs opportunities, but good jobs opportunities. So there is an issue of ensuring that people can transit to new jobs. So that requires also a readaptation of the economy. So as I mentioned already, the point of trainings and upskillings, especially for the most vulnerable. But let's not forget that, again, this pandemic hit the time where we all need to concentrate efforts in terms of fighting climate change. So we're talking about the necessity of making sure that the recovery is inclusive and green at the same time. And so when we're talking about transiting to new jobs and readapting the economy, we're also talking about skilling and upskilling and creating job opportunities in the green sectors. Finally, let me perhaps close on this one to say that what we have seen, because of course the workers that have been hit the hardest during the pandemic were the ones that were the least connected, let's say, to regular jobs and to standard jobs. So this is during the first months in the OECD countries when the pandemic hit. Let's say the majority of countries sort of introduce some quick sort of fixes to make sure that the social protection schemes could be extended, that could be covered the non-standard workers. And now we must ensure that those fixes actually become, structural and permanent changes and really are able to provide income and other opportunities to all type of workers. So I think I'll leave it here. I have other points, but I already spoken quite long, and I'm sure we'll be able to return to some of those points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Romina. And I think that was an important point about people's demands globally, that the situation we now face translate itself into more permanent change rather than simply being a temporary fix. And the sort of polling that you covered for the OECD, it's very interesting and is something that we're trying to support across more middle income and least developed countries to give them the same sort of opportunity. It's my pleasure now to turn over to Ingo Wiederhofer, the World Bank's lead social development specialist. Ingo, please, over to you.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you. So first, let me thank the Pathfinders Group and the Center for International Cooperation at New York University for the invitation to speak at this event. And I'd also like to thank the Ethiopian Mission to the UN for sponsoring this important side event. Lastly, let me acknowledge the representatives, the excellencies from the governments, as well as colleagues from the other multilateral organizations and academia on this panel. So following on the comments from the colleague from the OECD, I will focus my comments more on the middle income and less developed countries where the World Bank does more of its work. So in a crisis of this scale and nature, no single intervention will be enough, and countries need to mobilize every tool at their disposal. Responses to the pandemic thus require a whole of society approach, with solutions coming from national as well as local governments, from civil society, from communities, and from the private sector. Urgent support really needs to work at multiple levels, the national levels, local levels, and then of course, direct assistance for poor and vulnerable households and communities. The World Bank has moved quickly to help countries respond to the COVID pandemic by providing support across 4 thematic areas. First, on the health front, by helping to save lives threatened by the pandemic. Second, efforts to protect the poor and vulnerable. Third, securing the foundations of the economy. And fourth, strengthening policies and institutions for resilience based on transparent, sustainable debt and investments. By May 2020, our emergency efforts have basically become active in over 100 countries, with projects adapted and financing going out to over 100 countries. Within this broader context, I will focus my remarks on the second pillar of the bank's response of protecting the poor and vulnerable, which have been particularly hard hit both by the pandemic and its related impacts. Nearly 80% of the world's informal economy workers, 1.6 billion people or so, have faced COVID-19 lockdowns and slowdowns in hard-hit industries, including wholesale and retail, food and hospitality, tourism, transport, and manufacturing. With 740 million women globally in informal employment and a majority employed in services, women are particularly hard hit by this crisis. Remittance flows, an economic lifeline for many low-income families and a key source of revenues for many developing economies, are expected to fall by at least 1/5 in 2020. The effects of the pandemic are both immediate and likely to be long-lasting. Our latest forecasts anticipate that millions of people will fall into extreme poverty, while millions of existing poor will experience even deeper deprivation, the first increase in global poverty since 1998. This will mean an additional, for example, an additional 18 million extremely poor people in countries affected by fragility and conflict, in lower income countries. The pandemic is deepening existing sources of fragility and exacerbating instability in countries already affected by fragility and violence. Moreover, the pandemic is exacerbating specific risks for women, with sharp increases in domestic and gender-based violence and a substantial increase in emergency calls for domestic violence cases. To respond to a crisis of this scale in real time, we've sought to rapidly adapt and build upon our existing portfolio, including cash transfer programs, local government support, community-driven development operations, and food security operations. Using these instruments, we expect our response to shortly reach over 1 billion persons across the world. The emphasis on our side is on operations which are actually or could potentially reach large numbers of the economically, socially, or geographically vulnerable, and that can work effectively as part of an overall safety net approach for both immediate and recovery needs. Initially, the focus is more on income and potentially food security support, as well as ensuring access to basic services for the poor and the new poor. In the medium term, the emphasis will hopefully shift towards employment, productive inclusion, and building back better. Social protection programs play an important role in this response, especially in places where they provide well-functioning, effectively targeted, and quick dispersing mechanisms of support to households. Over 190 countries have at this point already adapted social protection programs to respond to COVID, ranging from cash transfers, which can be conditional and unconditional, once-off or recurrent, school feeding, childcare support, and pension enhancements, among many others. While the World Bank's support for traditional or social protection programs, usually aimed at providing household-level safety nets, remains central to the bank's response, the support for local government and community operations offer important complementarities that I'll talk about a little bit now. First, such efforts can provide funds directly and quickly to vulnerable communities and groups. Funds can be transferred on the same day where electronic transfers are possible, in places such as India, or up to 10 days in remote or conflict-affected areas. Community development programs were first responders after disasters such as the Asian tsunami of 2004 and the 2013 typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines, for example. They're also able to deliver in contexts where government administrative systems are weak or absent, such as in some fragile and conflict-affected states. Such programs can reach the poor and new poor who are not on formal beneficiary registries, for example, migrant workers, refugees, poor women, and others. In Africa, for example, informal workers represent over 80% of the workforce, and these are often not included in formal government registries and will be extremely vulnerable during this crisis. Community development and local government programs can also be quite flexible and fluid. Local authorities and communities are often the ones that know first and best who are the new poor in their areas and who are the most vulnerable. And they're the ones who can also respond most immediately. And lastly, such efforts can also address food security concerns. A good number of community development operations operate in rural areas and work with farmer organizations to produce food and keep the supply chains moving. Two examples of what this means in practice would be first in India. In India, the bank is working with the government on to support women's self-help groups, which are on the front line of the COVID-19 health response and are actively engaged in distributing pensions and direct benefit transfers to citizens and group members. These groups are also providing valuable food services to their communities, including community kitchens for migrant workers, homeless persons, and destitute households, as well as providing doorstep grocery and vegetable supplies delivery in many cities, while maintaining social distancing norms. These women's groups are also involved in producing 22 million masks, sanitizers, PPEs, and other products for the healthcare system. They're also organizing farmers to deliver key production and market support services for agricultural and other livelihoods. In Afghanistan, the government is drawing on its Citizens Charter program, a national community development program, to try to reach up to 90% of its households with COVID response support. The government was the first to immediately activate this platform to send out COVID preventative health messages and to explore ways to channel funds directly to communities and vulnerable groups. These messages, which are often sent through trusted community leaders, are particularly important to gain community trust and to reach out to local religious leaders to send accurate health messages and avoid rumors and stigmatization of certain groups. The government is in the process of expanding this program to all accessible areas in the country and to continue to provide both health messaging as well as essential food and health supplies, especially for vulnerable groups such as poor women, pastoralists, migrants, and returnees. In Ethiopia, we have been working for some time with the government on the Productive Safety Net program, which has both large urban and rural elements and which has been adapted to the COVID context to provide for advance payments and social distancing protocols at this time. In addition, we're in discussions with the Ethiopian government on how, through the existing development responses for displacement engagement, we can continue to help communities in refugee hosting areas in Ethiopia to support both host and refugee communities in the response. As the crisis is fast moving and evolving, we're also gearing up on our monitoring. Overall, the bank is obviously quite heavily involved in poverty monitoring. We're complementing this with social impact monitoring to better understand the effects of COVID over time on the most vulnerable groups: women, indigenous people, and Afro-descendants, persons with disabilities, the LGBTI community. There's such a differentiated understanding. I'm wrapping up. Such a differentiated understanding will be critical to help with poverty, both with targeting as well as to informing adaptive and customized responses as we go forward over time. Thanks, Sarah. That's it.
Thank you, Ingo, very much, and also for drawing attention to some of the community-driven measures that can very much complement individual household targeting and social protection, and be a way, I think, of building the kind of trust and capital that we were talking about earlier. It's my pleasure now to hand over to Professor Taye Waris from the University of Nairobi. Taye, among many other titles, is the Director of Research and Enterprise at the university and a Professor of Fiscal Law and Policy. Taye.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Good evening, everybody, wherever you are. Thank you very much for including me in this incredible panel. I can see we all always have lots to say, so it's great to be in a space where we have lots of ideas. It's not often. I'm honored to be on a panel with such amazing people. So all protocols observed, as we say in our part of the world. I'm going to try and simplify what I have to say into about 10 or 11 points. A lot of what I could have said has been said before, so I will not repeat it. But I'd like to start with an African proverb that says that we may share the same sun, but we don't share the same roofs. And this probably illustrates for me the biggest difference between inequalities and vulnerabilities. We initially thought people were living under roofs, but people are on the streets. That is the increasing vulnerabilities that we're seeing across the continent. And as we reflect on this incredible African proverb, I'm going to take you through these 11 points. And the first one is echoing what others have said. We have issues around shock resilient systems, but there are two types of vulnerabilities that we are seeing on the African continent. We have the countries that have been dealing with emergencies and shocks in the past, those, for example, that have had conflict. And then we've had others that have had fairly peaceful regimes for the past 40, 50 years. And one of the biggest vulnerability at a national level that is showing itself already is that those that were not going through previous shocks actually are completely unable to deal with the current one. So if you're a country that's emerged from war, and the example that comes to mind is Rwanda, then your ability to shift and move quickly through an emergency is much better than countries like Kenya that haven't gone through similar wartime experiences. And we see this more and more as we continue. And so the first thing is identifying who is vulnerable, whether it is at individual, community, national, or continental level. On the continent, that's what we're seeing. The second point is about integrating the informal. We keep talking about interventions, but most of them are targeting those in the formal sector. Now, as has been said earlier, 80% of Africans are actually informal or working in agricultural spaces. But we've also had a problem with companies that don't register all their staff or employees. Now, they immediately fall into the informal, and they're the first ones to be left off. We also have those who are working on contract basis. We have those in the gig economy, the few that are there. And these immediately fall into the informal sector because they didn't have labor protections under these different rates that they were working on. So that size of informality is actually much bigger than is being perceived, I think, in certain scenarios. The third problem that is showing itself, which has been mentioned, is the fact that women are being left out of the systems. And I suppose on a slightly light note, more and more, I'm now seeing, for example, panels of speakers across the continent on webinars that are predominantly male. So this access of women into spaces is not just about access in fiscal spaces or access to jobs, it's also access to their voices. Their voices are also not being heard in a lot of spaces. And I think that that is a key point that we need to talk about. But the expanding fiscal space has also been discussed by many of the previous speakers. And we've talked about solidarity funds and taxes. South Africa has a solidarity fund. Kenya is looking to has also set up a private sector fund that's looking at solidarity. But what is missing in a lot of these funds is there isn't engagement with what data should be showing. And that takes me to the next point. The data doesn't show what people think it shows. And some of the biggest debates happening in many African countries right now is that, do we really know where the curve is? And no, we don't. because we're not doing enough testing, because we can't afford to do enough testing. So where do we know we have reached is a problem? How do we know when to control it has become a problem as well. And as we are continuing to roll out interventions, are we then rolling out the right intervention at the right point in time if the data is not clear? And here is where I think the Kenyan government is doing a really good job, because they have engaged with my teams of researchers, for example, at the University of Nairobi, and we are constantly giving them interventions and giving them real-time reactions to what is happening on the ground. I hope it is something that can be replicated also in other countries, because I think during the pandemic, one thing that is showing itself is that you cannot also rely on outside consultants. The people that know what is going on are your academics and your researchers and your scholars that are on the ground and have been doing the work already. And so the issue of data
I want to make sure we get all your points, but I also just would ask you so we can go back to the panel with one question to move through them quickly.
No problem. I have
apologies for the time.
That's okay. So of my last 3 points, the next is the issue of having emergency fundings. And I really like the idea that has been raised about a global solidarity fund. And I think that this is a watershed moment for the United Nations. You've got the UN Tax Committee operating, you've got UN ECOSOC, you've got UNCTAD, but until now, the goals 16 and 17 were not really being brought together. And I think COVID is a wonderful space to actually bring your teams from across the UN bodies to now start looking at how to finance these issues. And I think that is quite an important thing going forward, because we have a problem when it comes to dealing with the financing part of it. The last issue that I will cover, because I know that we are tight on time, is the issue of collapsing value chains. We talk about the vulnerabilities and the need to support food, but we have a problem. We have produce rotting in the farms, and we have curfews, and then we have city lockdowns. And this is a problem that is now affecting most of the continent, because food produce is not reaching where it needs to reach. And this is a problem that I think we really need to deal with. I am going to stop there and hope I get questions so I can speak more later. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Atira. And actually, let me take you up on this directly, because we have a couple of questions that came in from the floor. Let me also just first check with our people if we are able to go over 10 minutes. Will we be cut off? I don't want to go over too much in respect for people's time, but we do have a couple of questions. Can you just confirm? Okay, I assume that that's fine and we won't be cut off very bluntly. So we have a couple of questions. One is from Sarah Willett from the Open Societies Foundation. And Diani, I was going to ask if you might make some comment on this. This is, how can social protection systems best address the vulnerability of informal and precarious workers? And I know in Indonesia, you've done a lot of thinking about how to reach the informal sector. I'd welcome also comments from others, from Alicia or Rola, or back to Atiyah on that question. And there is a second question, if people can indicate if they're interested in answering this, which is on the role of promoting basic income as part of the solution. What do we think about basic income solutions, and what are the mechanisms, if we think that they are an avenue worth pursuing, to promote them? Perhaps Diani, to take yours first. I want also to recognize that it's well past midnight in Jakarta, and we thank you very much for being with us at this time.
Okay, thank you very much, Ibu Sarah, so for the question from the Open Society. So I think this is a very important for Indonesia as well, and also looking at heard about the colleague from the countries that talking about how the problem that face in terms of the pandemic. So I think first that for the informal sector in Indonesia, that the government focused that how that the small, medium enterprise, micro enterprise now is going to be focused for the government to encourage them, just to make it empower. And I think what the policies that we intervene in terms of the how to support from the budget perspective, and also from the access access for the like a tax remittance, and then how to give access that for the informal sector also to make them that they can independence in how they to cope from the poverty. But of course that like other countries that even though that we have quite many programs in terms of the social protection, so we still face some several major issues like the we have so many targets that within the program. I think there's also that the duplication and also the silos among the respective ministry. It is our challenges, and the implication is also about the we have so many multiple targets of each program. And the second one, I think that's several speakers also mentioned about the lack of data management. Informal sector, so it's also that we face our difficulty how to make the accurate of the informal sector. But I think right now our government try to improve the data, especially for the how that to make it balance between how to support the health intervention also with the economic intervention. And the third one that how to about the in terms of the informal sector that to make it that the I think I'm interested that how that the access between the government and also with the how the government responds very quickly with the how that the informal sector's needs. I think this is also a challenge for Indonesia. But so far that we are trying to conduct several programs that hopefully that in for the next year can be more measure and then better for this how to we cope from the COVID-19. Ibu Sarah.
Thank you very much, Ibu Diani. And I think as you had mentioned earlier, and also Ingo from the World Bank had mentioned, the community-driven mechanisms and the village law that you have in Indonesia is one method of reaching the informal sector. And I know you've also had some interesting experimentation with the gig economy, with dealing with big companies like Gojek, which have millions of informal sector workers employed in things like motorcycle delivery and how to ensure them benefit. I'm going to ask perhaps if Alicia and then Rola would like to comment on those questions, and then I'll ask if Ambassador Bermudez or Amde want to make a word.
Thank you so much, Sarah. In terms of the informal sector, I think this pandemic is bringing an opportunity to have a complete social register, because people are being invited to register and to be, let's say, to be eligible for example, for the basic emergency income or for the food bonus. So I think this is a great opportunity to have a full social register, and I think governments are really trying to do that. Peru, for example, has 70% of their working labor is informal, so they're trying very hard to do this. Secondly, social financial inclusion, I think, is also very important. I have to say that Chile has a system that is very, very efficient, the Banco de Estado, with the national banks, that people also have an account just because they have an identity role. So we should use those type of instruments to try to know where the informal people are. The second question in relation to the basic income, let me tell you that we have calculated how much a basic emergency income will cost for 6 months, and it accounts to 1.9% of GDP, in addition to what governments are doing. We consider that if we can consolidate many of the cash transfer proposals, many of these helps are being done in a very silo way. So we are trying to find out if we can consolidate these cash transfers or these transfers in general for the population, and this could become a basic income without conditionality, because I think this is also very important. And has to be targeted. We don't think that it could be universal upfront. We have to go gradually to that, and we have calculated different costings for example, to cover the young people, for example, or to cover the elders, or to etc. So we believe that this could be a gradual, and each country will have to find its own mechanisms to approach it. But we do believe that a basic income is essentially universal. At the end of the day, universal for certain groups of population, not universal for the whole population. This doesn't work for a region like ours. But why a basic basic income is so important? It's an emancipation. It's a subsistence income rather, and this crisis is going to take very long. It's not going to be a short-term crisis. So we need to put in place, at least for the next 2 years or maybe 3, these basic incomes in place, and to do it properly, because otherwise demand is going to be very contracted, as we know. And the other point I want to raise is, how do we protect the productive sector? I think that's another question, and we have calculated if we want to rescue micro enterprises. That's very important, because that's the future at the end of the day, and how they have to reconvert themselves, and the small and medium size. And for the big, larger companies, I didn't mention this, we have to put some conditions to the larger companies. Yes, I think rescue is in place for some strategic companies like airlines, but they cannot invest in tax havens, they cannot distribute their profits, and they have to preserve their employment, and they have to move towards sustainability. So yes, there is a menu of things that should be done. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Alicia. Rola, over to you, and then I know I cut Taye earlier, so Taye, I'll go back to you on one of these 2 questions if you'd like to answer. Rola first.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. And I think following up what is stated regarding the informal sector, I think it's a very good opportunity is to create a registry depository for the informal sector, because they're trying to get some assistance from the states. And this is where we can understand how to target them better, so that we'll move them to the formality without their worries not to be included. But I still need to say that the stress in the fiscal space in the developing and the LDCs countries are not allowing governments to put more fiscal stimulus to support all the other measures we are talking about, what Alicia is talking about, cash measurements or others. Today, we found out that on average, the global fiscal stimulus is around 11% of the GDP of the global community. LDCs spend on average 6.3%, almost half of the global average on stimulus packages. And the reason is because of their fiscal constraints into it. And this is where it comes us to say the smart spending, innovative smart spending, to allocate the resources of the limited resources becomes extremely important for governments. And the second thing is also, because of the limited fiscal space, we're saying it's not only the responsibility of the states. This is where the other stakeholders has to come in, and not in terms of taxation and tax savings or tax contribution, in terms of social responsibility and shared responsibility and solidarity, societal solidarity. And this is where we're talking about other stakeholders has to come in, not as a fragmented, but institutionalizing the process itself. COVID is one element that shows us that we need to revisit our whole modality of transformative change, because we're gonna be faced with other crises down the line. And so the whole thing of the notion of how do all stakeholders participate in institutionalizing the process is extremely important into that. And I keep on saying that the private sector plays a role. Chamber of Commerce, we never heard about where their role is. And the role is to promote and safeguard the medium, small enterprises, if they engage them in their supply chain, if they engage them in debt reliefs, in the, not only the burden on the government itself. And this is where we think we need to move further, and we need also to expand the fiscal space of developing countries to recover better and fast. And this is where the solidarity, global solidarity funds is targeting. And so they target the vulnerable groups. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Rola. Atiyah, over to you. Then I'll ask Ingo and Romina if they want a very, very quick word. I know now we're out of time, and then I'll go back to the two ambassadors before we finish. Atiyah.
Thank you, Sarah. So quick answers for a lot of the ideas coming up. In March, we were already suggesting an adopt a family approach. So when you talk about basic minimum income, what would they want? And we did a study, and they were asking for $50 a month. And they felt that that was enough for them as a whole family. Now, this is in Kenya. And in other parts of Africa, it's probably even less. But then this is basic survival. And we don't want survival. We do want stability and growth to also come in at an individual family level, but it's still a potential solution. The other thing is that most people are registered to vote. They all have identity cards. We have all mobile phone payment systems. Now, we may not have internet penetration on the continent, but we do use USSD codes for cash transfers, for example. And this is a really easy way to get money quickly down into the grassroots. It would take a lot less than the 10 days I've heard suggested if we just keep off the other systems. And that's also a quick way to move the money around. The other thing is this question about a global fund and the space that it takes. And yes, a solidarity fund at national or global level would be fantastic. But my biggest problem is, who are we protecting? And who is the productive protection? And the example I'd like to give is Jamaica, where one of the sets of people they immediately protected were actually the barbers and the saloon owners and the masseurs. And the reason that they selected them very quickly was because those were the people who were going to lose business immediately when the tourism sector collapsed. So identifying that vulnerability becomes really important. And I think I'm just going to stop by saying that benchmarking is going to be a problem. So we need to not benchmark, and we need to make sure we're having unique solutions to all of these. Thank you. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Atiyah. Would Romina or Ingo, would you like a quick word? Romina?
Yes, sure. Just to say actually that my answers on minimum income are very much aligned to those that Alicia just shared with us, because I think the OECD really thinks that there is scope to actually consolidate and streamline the various type of sort of mechanisms and schemes that get close to minimum income and other type of sort of income support. The other point is about making sure that actually those systems are designed in a very, very effective manner, because you still have issues of low take-up rate and low receipt rate in the OECD countries, low waiting, very long waiting until you get access to this to the minimum income. So there is really a possibility there to improve the current system. And finally, because of course the fiscal pressure is going to mount, the need is there, I think, to think of those minimum income as better targeted, and so also to make sure that the schemes are made responsive, let's say, to the economic change in circumstances, or things gets better. There is probably less need to give access to that type of support for the ones that go back, to the labor market. And final words. Interestingly, we're working at the OECD with a number of companies that are taking action to, in fact, reduce inequalities in the wake of the pandemic. And those companies are actually looking into things such as living and decent wages. These are companies that are not headquartered in countries where there is any sort of regulation around minimum income or minimum wages, and yet those companies think there is a lot of value actually in introducing living or decent wages in their companies. And so I think this is quite an encouraging sign that in the private sector there is a strong recognition that the recovery needs to be made more inclusive.
Thank you, Romina. And I agree, there are some shifts in the private sector that we're seeing just in the last couple of weeks that I think do recognize some of those dynamics. Ingo, on the informal sector, perhaps in particular, would you like a couple of words?
Well, perhaps just 2 points. I think the first one, and this builds, I think, also of Atiyah and the colleague from Indonesia's points. So the importance, I think, of having complementary and multiple targeting approaches to try and figure out what's going on and who is vulnerable. So in the case of Indonesia, for example, the village funds program that the government has was able to identify that there were 1.9 million female-headed households that were in need of supplementary assistance, and that then received it through the village funding program that hadn't been picked up in the regular social protection scheme of the government. That's a significant number. So having these multiple, I think, layers and approaches is the first thing. And then I think related also to this is being able to customize and respond. So figuring out, listening to the communities and the households and the families as to what their needs are, and then trying to customize. So I'm not sure that one size fits all will be feasible in many parts of the world, either fiscally or logistically and technically, and thus trying to both target and customize through providing flexibility, I think, at local levels for responses, and making sure that you then have the accountability systems around those will be important. Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Ingo, for that. It built very well, I think, on what others said. Back to Luis, Ambassador Bermudez, if you want a word, and then I'll go last to Ambassador Amde before I sum up. Luis.
Thank you, Sarah. I just want to add to the my previous presentation and other co-panelists. I would like, something is very important, just to allow or promote this migration from informality to formality. The registries are important. We have to work not only in the national level, we have to do it in a state, provincial, and local levels as well, because the gathering of information is crucial. And besides, within the state, I believe we have to have one or two very visible articulators. Sometimes we have the feeling that one track is for social protection policies and programs, and a different track and very separated is for regular policies, trade, financial services, global services, tourism, different things. But we have to do something. The best social protection program or system is the one that has an expiry date, because it means that economy and the living condition of those that are behind improves and we don't need them anymore. But sometimes we have not to persist on doing these two tracks parallel. We have to intersect them. So in order that the good results of the internal economy or the foreign trade replicates immediately in these social protection programs, and we have to not promote forever or increase permanently the budgetary allocation for these programs in order to giving them some expiry date or a limited life, because on the contrary, we will be, states are sometimes financing bottomless bags or portions of budget in order to cover very legitimate, in a legitimate way, the needs of these people. But we have to intersect more frequently these policies, and we need within the state articulators that promote and facilitate this task. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. And I think that relates also to some other innovation that has been going on during COVID, which is looking at the graduation approaches in social protection policies and seeing if there is a way of transferring assets, not only transitional income, to people to be able to allow them a more permanent exit. Ambassador Amde, Taye, over to you.
Thank you very much once again, Sarah. What indeed we did in Ethiopia was that we re-energize or reposition the existing program that has been there for a number of years, particularly the productive safety net that covers over 8 million people, and also the urban component of the productive safety net program, as Inga earlier mentioned, from the World Bank, that also covered over 600,000 families, and also the community-based health insurance scheme that covers 22 million people. We just reposition those programs in order to respond for the COVID pandemics. But I want to say that one point is that it is right, no single intervention would be enough, as Ingo mentioned. On the one hand, as Dr. Taye said, that do we really know the magnitude of the pandemic in each one of our countries? We know we are in the thick of it, but we don't have the adequate data to respond. But having listened to each one of you, it reminds me that when the pandemic hit, humanity in general, our conviction was indeed, we shall not lose lives. Definitely, that was a conviction, but we lost many, many lives. And then we said that we shall not lose hope. But after listening, so many of the institutions and also the policy measures taken by our government, whether it is adequate or not, we say that hope is still alive. If we come together, build our solidarity, there is a good chance that we can overcome and also build better in overcoming this pandemic. One thing that we have overcome is there was a complete impoverished discourse, a total denial. This was at one point prevailing, but the reality was completely different because it exasperated our fragility and it hit into the core of our values of our society. So what I hear today from the intervention of UN agencies, financial institutions, academics, and countries is that it gives us more hope whenever we come together in union and coming also with new ideas, as Dr. Rolla mentioned on the societal solidarity fund. Mm-hmm. Those are the creative ways to overcome this challenge and of course stand for humanity. Thank you, Sarah, for once again, appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Taye, and also for your sponsorship of this event, which I think had a very, very rich discussion in it. I'm going to sum up very quickly. I have just 7 quick points, but I'll try to do them completely telegraphically to get through. It's always difficult to sum up a rich discussion. I think the first point that was made is that building back better is about long-term change, not only about what we do short-term in social protection systems. The second, and linked to that it's an opportunity for reform to health and social protection systems, and that can include both adapting existing programs, which all of the countries present did that as part of their response to COVID-19, for example, but it can also mean seizing the opportunity to really look at what other more root and branch longer term reforms that are needed. Third, that the response has to be multi-track in many different ways. So multi-track in terms of national ministries, cutting across national ministries, in terms of national and local levels, and in terms of the states working with different partners. So this is not something that states alone can respond to. They need to look at partnership with civil society and with the private sector to achieve a result. Fourth, that we know, I think, a lot of the measures, although these are being innovated all the time. So these include, of course, cash transfers, supplemented by community programs, support to small and medium enterprises, as well as to larger industrial sectors, well identified as to those that are really most vulnerable. And that within that, there are a couple of cross-cutting elements. One is the idea of co-responsibility that was mentioned by different speakers, so that these measures are not just from the state down to the people, they're actually designed with the people and the partners who are affected. The other is very strong public information campaigns. And we know that this has been a long-standing deficit in many, many countries, but it has shown how important this is during the pandemic. The fifth point I have, and I see actually I have 8, not 7, that's always a difficulty, is on basic income and the informal sector that were asked as questions. So on basic income, I think there was a general consensus that this is an opportunity to streamline what has often been developed in many countries as very fragmented programs and try to consolidate this into one. That while universal may be a desirable area to go, for most regions and countries, it's not feasible at the moment. And so one would be talking about basic income to targeted groups of people. On the informal sector, that this is again a challenge everywhere, but that there are different approaches, again, looking at community-driven approaches as a way to reach the informal sector, support to micro and small enterprises, using multiple targeting mechanisms at the same time. And I was struck by the point that sometimes you pick up the informal sector when you have a second level of targeting that goes outside your formal data. And last, looking at how we're experimenting with approaches that give assets, not just transitional income, to people in the informal sector. Then sixth, financing came up as we would expect several times. And I think the idea very strongly of forms of solidarity funds, both national, where there is a real narrative to society that this is a time everyone needs to contribute, and international for those countries who cannot on their own maintain an adequate response. Seventh, that this is, because of the kind of challenges we've outlined, this is a political challenge as well as a technical one. So it is about reforming to some extent our vision of societies, vision of democracies, who contributes, who needs to be protected, the relationship between citizens and the state, and overcoming, as Taye said in the last point, an impoverished dialogue perhaps that we've had in the past, being able to have a much more direct dialogue about many of these aspects. And last, that I think we identified a variety of areas where collective action is necessary. So being able to address some of the financing challenges, being able to address how do the private sector contribute, being able to exchange on lessons of what works and how, really requires an international collective action as well as a strong national response. So I'm sure that I've missed many points because this was a very rich discussion, but I think that these were very, very useful points that were made. I'd like to thank very much all the panelists for joining from very many different locations. A special word again for Diani for staying up so late in Jakarta. We thank you for bringing that experience. And last, I would like to thank the co-sponsoring countries and our own team at CIC, Michael, Paul, Karina, and the CIC team. Many thanks to everyone for this very interesting exchange.
Many thanks, Sarah. Goodbye.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.